The Kingdom of Benin, located in what is now southern Nigeria, was a highly organized and sophisticated society. It was renowned for its elaborate court rituals, powerful kings known as Obas, and remarkable artistic achievements, particularly in bronze casting. The kingdom had maintained its independence for centuries, even as European powers began establishing trade relationships along the West African coast. By the late 19th century, the British Empire was expanding rapidly across Africa, driven by the Industrial Revolution's demand for raw materials and new markets. The British were particularly interested in the palm oil trade, which was essential for making soap and lubricants for machinery. The Niger Coast Protectorate was established by the British in 1884 to control the region's trade, and they sought to extend their influence further inland. The Kingdom of Benin, however, resisted British attempts to impose control over its trade and political affairs. The Oba of Benin, Ovanramon Nogbesai, maintained a policy of isolation, limiting European access to his kingdom and tightly controlling commerce. This resistance frustrated British officials, who saw Benin as a barrier to their economic and territorial ambitions. Tensions between Benin and the British came to a head in the early 1890s. In 1892, a British official, Captain Henry Galway, was sent to Benin City to negotiate a treaty that would open the kingdom to British influence. Galway, who had little understanding of Benin's political and cultural context, pressured Oba Ovanramon into signing a treaty that he presented as a simple trade agreement. However, the treaty effectively turned Benin into a British protectorate, undermining the Oba's authority and sovereignty. Oba Ovanramon later repudiated the treaty, claiming that he had been deceived and that the terms were misrepresented. The British, however, used the treaty as a pretext to increase their pressure on Benin. The situation deteriorated further in 1896 when British traders began complaining about the Oba's restrictions on trade, and the Niger Coast Protectorate's administration became more determined to bring Benin under control. The immediate cause of the British invasion was the so-called Benin Massacre. In late 1896, Acting Consul General James Phillips of the Niger Coast Protectorate, frustrated by the Oba's refusal to comply with British demands, decided to lead an uninvited expedition to Benin City. Phillips planned to depose the Oba and install a government more amenable to British interests. He wrote to the British Foreign Office, explaining that he intended to open up Benin as a British protectorate and warning that force might be necessary. Phillips organized a small party of British officials, traders, and African porters, and on January 4, 1897, they set out for Benin City. Phillips ignored warnings from Benin chiefs that the Oba was conducting annual religious ceremonies and that any approach to the city would be seen as an act of aggression. The chiefs advised him to postpone his visit, but Phillips, confident in British superiority, pressed on. As the expedition neared the village of Ogaton, close to Benin City, they were ambushed by Edo warriors. Almost the entire party, including Phillips, was killed. Only 2 members of the expedition survived and managed to escape to the coast. The news of the massacre sent shockwaves through the British administration and provided the justification they needed to launch a full-scale military campaign against the Kingdom of Benin. In response to the massacre, the British organized a military force known as the Benin Punitive Expedition. The force consisted of around 1,200 soldiers, including British Marines and African troops, under the command of Rear Admiral Harry Rawson. The expedition was heavily armed with modern weaponry, including Maxim guns, an early type of machine gun, cannons, and rockets, making them far superior to the Edo warriors in terms of firepower. The objective of the expedition was clear: to capture Benin City, depose the Oba, and bring the kingdom under British control. On February 9, 1897, the British forces began their advance on Benin City. The expeditionary force encountered stiff resistance from the Edo warriors, who fought bravely to defend their land and their king. Despite their courage, the Edo were outmatched by the British superior firepower and military organization. As the British troops advanced, they burned villages, destroyed crops, and killed anyone who opposed them. The march towards Benin City was brutal and systematic, aimed at breaking the kingdom's will to resist. The British faced some of their fiercest resistance at the village of Ologbo, where Edo warriors ambushed the advancing troops. However, the British eventually overcame the defenders, inflicting heavy casualties and pushing onward. On February 18, 1897, the British forces reached the gates of Benin City. They found the city largely deserted, as Oba Onramwen and many of his chiefs had fled into the surrounding forest. The British troops entered the city without much resistance and began what can only be described as a systematic looting spree. Benin City was known for its wealth of art and culture, and the British soldiers were astonished by the treasures they found. They looted thousands of artifacts, including the famous Benin bronzes, intricately cast plaques and statues that depicted the history, religion, and life of the Benin people. These bronzes, along with other artworks and treasures, were shipped back to Britain, where they were distributed among museums, private collectors, and institutions across Europe. The looting of Benin City was one of the most significant acts of cultural plunder in colonial history. The loss of these artifacts was devastating to the Benin people, as they were not just art, they were integral to the kingdom's identity, history, and religious practices. The British justified their actions by portraying the Benin people as barbarians, and their culture as inferior, a common colonial rationale used to legitimize such acts of theft and violence. Following the fall of Benin City, the British declared the Kingdom of Benin annexed to the Niger Coast Protectorate. The Oba's palace was burned to the ground, and much of the city was left in ruins. Oba Onramwen, who had fled into the forest, was eventually captured by the British in August 1897. In September of the same year, he was formally deposed and exiled to Calabar, where he lived under British supervision until his death in 1914. With the fall of Benin, the British established a colonial administration that sought to dismantle the traditional structures of power in the kingdom. They appointed their own officials to govern the area, introduced new laws, and imposed taxes. The once powerful and independent Kingdom of Benin was reduced to a part of the British Empire, its people subjected to foreign rule and its culture deeply scarred by the events of 1897. In recent years, there has been growing international pressure for the return of the Benin bronzes to Nigeria, part of a broader movement to repatriate cultural artifacts taken during the colonial era. The British conquest of the Benin Kingdom in 1897 was a turning point in the history of West Africa. It marked the end of one of the most powerful and culturally rich kingdoms on the continent and symbolized the broader process of European colonization that was sweeping across Africa. The fall of Benin was not just a military defeat, it was a profound cultural and psychological blow to the Edo people, whose kingdom had stood as a beacon of African civilization for centuries.